So before we start Daf Gimel, let's just remind ourselves that Rabba Bar Ula has a particular interpretation of the Mishnah Hakol Shochtim at the beginning of Masechet Chullin, and he interprets it as a reference to a Tameh who went ahead and he shechted an animal. And the issue would be, was he Metame the animal through his shechita? Meaning, did he come in contact with the animal that he's shechting? And in a case of what's called those who are careful about eating Altaras HaKodesh, Chullin Altaras HaKodesh, they want to guarantee that this Tameh, if he's going to shecht l'chatchila, and that's included on the Hakol Shoktan according to Rabbah, that he would not be metame the animal. So the Gemara suggests the possibility that he was shechting with a long knife in such a way that he did not come in contact with the animal. So the Gemara asks the following question: but what about the principle of cherev harehu kecholol? If we assume that this tameh came in contact with a dead body, and therefore he becomes what's called an avi avos hatuma, then the same status of avi avos hatuma will apply to the cherev, to the metal that he's using to shech the animal, which means that the metal itself has the status of avi avos hatuma. Now, the nafkamina is, if there were no principle of cherev harei kecholol, then what would happen is that the cherev itself would become tomei, but it could not transmit tuma to anything other than ochlin umashkin, and therefore everything would be fine. He would not be mitame through the cherev, the animal. But if we presume, which the Gemara doesn't even question this, that cherev harei kecholol, then despite the fact that the only thing that comes in contact with the animal is the sword itself, nevertheless, the sword has the status of avi avos hatuma, and now it can be mitame not only ochlin umashkin, but adam v'kelin. So the Gemara answers that even if you hold that he didn't come in contact by hand with the animal that he's shechting, but he came in contact with a corpse, a dead body, then what happens is that the cherev becomes an avatuma, l'tami l'sakin. I mean, the person who came in contact with the corpse is now avi avos hatuma, and the cherev now becomes an avatuma, l'tami l'sakin v'ozel sakin v'tami l'basa. So therefore, the Gemara now changes its understanding of the nature of the tumah of the shochet, according to Rabbi Bar Ula, and says eluditami b'sheretz. He did not, in fact, come in contact with a corpse and contract tumas mes, but rather he came in contact with the sheretz. And if he came in contact with the sheretz, then his status is that of a rishon l'tumah, and a rishon l'tumah is not metame kelim, only metame ochlin umashkin. So therefore, the knife that he's using to cut the animal, to slaughter the animal, is not tomei. And since he himself did not come in direct contact, and the only thing he came in contact with was the sakin, and the sakin does not contract tumah, therefore we know that he can be believed to say, I never came in contact with the animal, with the basa that I shechted. Iboy Sema, Liolam de Itme B'mes. Let me go back to my original premise that the Shochet contracted Tuma through contact with the dead body. You'll ask me, what about Cherev Harei Kechol Kigon Shebodak Krumis Shalkana V'Shochat Bo? Now, Krumis Shalkana means a stalk of a reed, which is wood and is not metal. And therefore, the halach of Cherev Harei Kechol doesn't apply in the case of a kana. Now, this kana, he checked out, make sure it has no nicks, and therefore, you can use it for shchita. Desanya, we don't need metal for shchita. Bakol shochtim, bein bitzar, bein bischuches, bein bikrumish al kana. So you can even check with a piece of glass or a reed, and this reed is not susceptible to tumah, and therefore even through a tummy mess, and therefore the shochi, could establish that he wasn't mitame the boss. So that's the end of Rabba Bar Ula for the time being. Omar Abaye now is going to raise an objection from the text of the Mishnah against the interpretation of the Mishnah of Rabba Bar Ula, Hachi Ktani, Akol Shochtin, Afilu Kusi. The Gemara is going to show later on why Abaye objected to the interpretation of Rabba. But Abaye substitutes it. He says, you know what Akol Shochtin means? Which case is included in the Mishnah that is L'chatchila okay, Afilu Kusi? Because Abaye is of the opinion that Kusim Gere Emesem, meaning even though they converted as a result of the scare of the attack of the lions, but nevertheless they were sincere in their conversion. And initially, when they were makabel Torah mitzvahs, then it was a valid gerus. But later on in history, they deviated from the path. They rejected the interpretations of Chazal, and they only remained committed to fulfill the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah. And now, let's read the Mishnah according to Abaye's interpretation. Akol Shokta Afilu Kusi, V'Pared V'Amurim, Olik Yisrael Omin Al Gabav. Abaye says that you need a Yisrael to witness the Shechita from the beginning of the Shechita till the end of the Shechita. And only if you had such a supervision can we rely on the Shechita of the Kusi. Aval Yotze v'Nichnas, which is one notch lower than Omer al Gabav, meaning maybe there was a Yisrael there at some point during the Shechita, maybe before, during, or after, but he was not there from beginning to end. And the question is whether the Kusi would be allowed to shecht in such a situation. Abaye says no. We do not upgrade the status of Yotze v'Nichnas and equate it with Omed al Gabav, and therefore lo yishchot. Now, that means that we're up to the next part of the Mishnah, Shchitasa Kshera, which means that b'diavad the Shchita is valid. V'im Shachat. How do we know now if, according to Abaye, in the absence of full-fledged supervision of Yisrael Omer Agabav, we're not allowed to let him, the Kusi, shecht? Then why does the Mishnah say that b'di'eved, if he went and he shechted, we can validate a shechita? And the answer is chotech kizayis basar nosein lo achalo mutar lechol achalo mutar lechol b'shchitaso lo achalo aso lechol b'shchitaso. We can test out this Kusi and determine whether or not he did a proper shechita, because he himself is very careful. He doesn't eat nevela or treifa. He only eats kosher meat that was shechted properly. Let's cut off a piece of the meat, give it to him and we'll see what happens. If he eats it, that's proof positive that he did a good shechita. Because again, he would not eat it if it wasn't a proper shechita. If, on the other hand, he refuses to eat it, then we're not going to rely on his shechita. And even though he is a ger in that sense, meaning the kusim, according to Abaye, are gerim, but nevertheless, unless there's some supervision or some sort of proof that the shechita was a valid shechita, like for example, he eats a kazayis from the basar, then we're concerned that, you know what, maybe the kusi did not shech properly. He doesn't know all the nuances of shechita, the laws of shechita. Not only that, the laws of shechita are not even in the Torah. And he only observes that which is in the Torah. Now we go to the next part of the Mishnah Kohen Tabai, and we're up to Chutz Micherishot V'Katan, and these three categories of people, Afilu Diavad Nabi Lo, we cannot rely on their shechita because you need das for shechita, and these three categories are Lav B'nei Das, and Shema Yishu, Shema Yidrusu, Shema Yachlidu, and they may passel the shechita with one of three possible psulei shechita. There are 5 psulei shechita all told. 2 of them, though, would be obvious that we could check the animal after shechita, but 3, you really can't check the animal and figure it out. Meaning, maybe he delayed in and took a pause in the middle of a shechita that's called shehiyah, and then maybe yidrusu means that instead of slicing the knife, they press the knife downward with the weight of the knife going down, or perhaps there was yachlidu, and that's called chalada. Chalada is a different kind of a psul, where instead of cutting from this direction, that direction, he cuts from underneath and up. In those 3 cases, we have no way of determining whether or not he bangled the shechita, whether he messed up the shechita. And therefore, in a case of a cherishot v'katan, without any supervision over shechita, the shechita is psula. But now the Gemara asks, v'kulun sheshachtu ahe. The Mishnah says that v'kulun sheshachtu shechitasan kshera. Let me just read it inside. Right, chutz v'cherishot v'katan, etc. V'kulun sheshachtu l'achein rono so shchitas kshera. Where is that going on? Hey, if you're going to tell me, acherishot v'katan, Allah kai. Right, the Mishnah is talking about cherishot v'katan. So what do you have to say? V'kulam im shachtu, etc. It should have said im shachtu mi boile, if they slaughtered. Ella, but rather you might say it's going back to kusi, which according to Abaye is the subject of the beginning of the Mishnah. Ha'amr kish Yisrael omen al gavav shachot afilu shchot afilu chatchila. So why are you telling me the kulam im shachtu kshero, which mashma di eved, when if you're talking about a case of gadol omed al gavav and there's supervision, then even lechatchila we can let the kusi shech, because we recognize his gerus. Kasha, the Gemara doesn't have an answer. Omar Rava. Now we have another interpretation. Rava is very similar to Abaye, but he argues with Abaye on one major point. Abaye rejected the possibility of nichnas v'yotze, whereas Omar Rava, yotze v'nichnas chatchilu lo vasnan. I have a Mishnah, and this Mishnah is in Avodah Zarah, that Aminiach ovi kochom b'chanus of Yisrael yotze v'nichnas mutter. We don't know whether the guy came in contact with the wine of the Jew, and he invited the guy into his storehouse where he has barrels and barrels of wine. And the Mishnah establishes that if there's a Yisrael that comes in and comes out, even though he's not there the whole time, that's enough to create mirsas. Mirsas means a fear on behalf of the guy that maybe the Jew will show up all of a sudden. It'll catch him, coming in contact with the wine inside the barrel. So that's a good enough reliance. And therefore, the Gemara says that Rava quoted that Mishnah as a proof that likewise in the case of a shchita of a kusi, if the Yisrael is nichnas v'yotze, even though he wasn't there the whole time, that's enough to rely on the fact that the kusi would have done a proper shchita. Frek the Gemara, hasam miktoni meniach, hameniach ktoni b'di'evet. You're not allowed to leave a guy who's oved avodah zarah in your, storehouse of yayin, of barrels of wine, because it doesn't say meniach oved kochav, invite the guy into your store. It says v'im heiniach, right? It says hameniach, if he went ahead and he was meniach, so that's only b'di'evet. So if that be the case, then how does Rava prove from the case of Yayin that Yotzei v'nichnas is upgraded to the same status as Omer al Gabov, and therefore allows you to invite the kusi to shecht the animal lechatchila? Elami hocha. Rather, Rava derives his conclusion about Yotze v'nichnas, as it were, upgrading it to Omer al Gabav, mehocha, from a Mishnah in Masechta Avodah Zarah. It says the Ein HaShomer Tzorach Lios Yoshev Mishamer. If you're leaving a guardian watching your wine to make sure that the guy doesn't tamper with your wine, then you don't have to sit there the whole time and watch him, but rather El Afal Pisha Yotze v'nichnas Mutter. So we see that Yotze v'nichnas is upgraded to the status of Omer al Gabov, and we can rely on him lechatchila, and we can invite the guy because we have a shomer, a Jew who's Yotze v'nichnas. And the same thing, therefore, says Rava, will apply in the case of shchita v'kusi, that all you need is Yotze v'nichnas. And then lechatchila, you could give him the knife and let him shech. So therefore, once having proven, based on the halacha of yayin in terms of an idolater, that Yotze v'nichnas is reliable, then Rava has to now reject Abaye and reinterpret the Mishnah in terms of kusi. El Amar Rava kol shochtim afilu kusi b'medvar mikshel Yotze v'nichnas. We don't need Omer Agabov, says Rava. If, on the other hand, the Jew arrived after the kusi had already shechted, there was no Yotze v'nichnas, there was no Omer Agabov, no supervision whatsoever, is then the best thing that we could do, b'di'eved, if there was no supervision up front, is chotek zayis basam v'nosein lo, achol mutar lachem shchotza lo achol. Depends whether the kusi is willing to eat from the basar of the shochet. And then we go back to the end of the Mishnah. Chutz micharishat v'katan da'afilu di'avid namilo. We cannot rely on the shechita of somebody who doesn't have das. Shema yisha, shema yidrusu, shema yachlu do, as we discussed earlier. And then we go back to the same shakavatari that we had before in Abaye. The kul sheshachtu ahei ilema acherishot v'katan is halakoi, and im shachto mi boile. El akusi hi ha'amrit yotze v'nichnas shachit l'chatchila. So we have that very technical difficulty that remains an outstanding difficulty in interpreting the Sefer of the Mishnah. So let's just review. We have now up to point 3 interpretations of our Mishnah. We've got Rava bar Ula that we're talking about a Tameh. And we say in the case of a Tomei that if he shechts it and testifies to the fact that he did not in any way matami the basar, then even though they're eating the basar taras hakodesh, we're fine, and that's okay l'chatchila. But if it was a behemoth kochim, that's a whole different story. Then we go to Abaye and Rava that both interpret the Mishnah in terms of kusi, and Machlokes between Abaye and Rava revolves around whether kusi l'chatchila could shecht if you have a yotzev v'nichnas. Now we have number 4. Rav Ashi Omar Hachi Ketani Hakol Shoktel Afil Yisrael Mumar. Now the word mumar here is subdivided into 2 fundamentally different categories. There's what's called a mumar litei avon and a mumar lahachis. So a mumar litei avon is someone who would eat kosher meat, and choose that over non-kosher meat if there's no loss. Like, let's say, for example, both are accessible, and both the kosher meat and the treifa meat cost the same amount of money. He'll eat the kosher meat. He's not a mumar lahachis who will dafka choose to eat the treifa meat. Now, in the case of mumar l'teyavon, if, for example, he's out there in the fields, he's on a trip, he's on a business trip, and there's no kosher food available, he'll eat the treifa food. And that makes him into a mumar. But keep in mind, he's a mumar l'davar echad. He's only a mumar for non-kosher food. He might be very observant with regard to other mitzvahs. Or do we say that mumar l'davar echad havi mumar l'kol tarkula? Mumar l'mai lechel nevel s'teyavon ukid Rava d'yamar Rava Yisrael mumar nevel s'teyavon is bodek sakim and osin lo muta lechel mishchitas. So what happens according to Rava in the case of a mumar ochel nevel s'teyavon? We're going to allow him to shech because he wants to, if all things are equal, eat kosher meat. So he doesn't want to mess up the shechita. But we have to check the knife first. And make sure the knife has no nicks, because otherwise the shechita is psula, it's completely invalid. You'll ask me, but according to Rava, the kusi is going to do a good shechita. Yeah, but he's not going to check the knife. He's not going to go through the bother of guaranteeing that there are no nicks in the knife. Because in event that there are nicks in the knife, he's got to get rid of this knife and replace it. That far, he's not going to go for the sake of kashrus. He's l'te'ova. Is therefore bodek sakin v'nosein lo.